The X-Men, Marvel's premier team of merry mutants, all because Stan Lee was lazy. No, seriously, the X-Men were created because Lee didn't want to come up with another superhero origin story. So instead of radioactive spiders or gamma bombs, he said, screw it, they're just born with powers. Over time, the X-Men evolved into powerful allegories for marginalized and oppressed groups. They were everywhere from the iconic 90s cartoon, the Fox films, and a massive fan base. But in the 2010s, the franchise hit a rough patch. The movie quality became inconsistent, and thanks to the Disney-Fox feud, the X-Men were pushed to the sidelines. But once Disney absorbed Fox into its ever-growing empire, the X-Men began to make a comeback, with X-Men 97, Deadpool and Wolverine, and their long-awaited return to the MCU. Still, many forget the X-Men didn't start off popular. Created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the same team behind Fantastic Four and the Avengers, the original X-Men struggled to stand out. Characters like Spider-Man, the Hulk, and the Thing were already speaking to outcasts and outsiders, wrestling with their identities in more compelling ways. By the late 60s, Lee and Kirby left the book and other creators tried to shake things up, introducing new characters like Havoc, who is Cyclops' long-lost brother, and Polaris, Magneto's long-lost daughter. Yet a lot of these were long-lost relatives, and this will be an overplayed trope in many X-Men comics down the line. But by 1970, the series was cancelled, with their last issue having the X-Men fight the Incredible Hulk, which was a good way to go out. However, the X-Men would still survive via reprints. You see, in the pre-digital age, reprints were the only way old comics could survive. Popular issues would be re-released sometimes a year later in cheaper formats so new readers could still buy them. So even though X-Men was cancelled, those old stories kept selling through reprints, proving there was still an audience for them. I remember hearing stories from my dad and other old school comic book fans on how they grew up with these reprints. Marvel noticed the demand and decided to bring the X-Men back, but this time with a twist. With Marvel's global success, the idea was to create a new diverse team, mutants from different countries, each representing different marginalized experiences. And this brings us to Giant-Size X-Men number 1, the issue that changed everything. So join me today as I go over this iconic story. Not only do I talk about what it's about, but how it represents the various peoples that are on the team. Also be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more videos like this. Also be sure to press the bell button, that way you'll be notified when a new video comes out. Now that we got that out of the way, let's dive on in, shall we? The story kicks off in West Germany, where an angry mob is chasing Kurt Wagner, better known as Nightcrawler. Branded a devil because of his appearance, Kurt's about to be killed until Professor Charles Xavier shows up and stops the crowd in their tracks. Xavier offers Kurt a new path, and thankfully Kurt agrees to join him. Next stop, Canada, where we meet the Wolverine. Xavier shows up at a military base and invites Logan to join the team. Now Logan's all for it, but his commanding officer, not so much. Wolverine threatens him on the way out, and the officer vows revenge, with Logan just brushing him off. Meanwhile in Tennessee, we meet Sean Cassidy, Banshee. Once a former enemy of the X-Men, Banshee joins up to redeem himself and make a fresh start. Then we head to Kenya, where a young woman named Aurora Monroe is worshipped as a goddess by a local tribe. She uses her powers to summon rain and a drought. Xavier shows up and gives her the classic, "You're not a goddess, you're a mutant" talk, basically telling her to stop living in a fantasy and join the real world. In Japan, Xavier recruits another old adversary, Shiro Yoshida, aka Sunfire. Shiro agrees to help out, if only to return a favor. Now to the Soviet Union, where a young Piotr Rasputin is working on a farm. When a runaway tractor threatens his little sister, he instinctively transforms, his skin turns into metal as he saves her life. Xavier appears and encourages him to use his powers for good, not just for the state. Piotr is reluctant, but with his parents' blessing, he joins up as Colossus. Finally, in the American Southwest, we meet John Proudstar, aka Thunderbird, as he wrestles a bison into submission. When Xavier offers him a place on the team, John responds with hostility fueled by his hatred for white people. But Xavier fires back by insulting John's people, the Apache, by saying they're all cowards, and through reverse psychology gets John to sign up. With a new team assembled, they meet Cyclops, who fills them in. The original X-Men, minus Beast, who was with the Avengers at the time, were sent to a mysterious island to investigate a mutant presence. Only Cyclops made it back, and weirdly his powers stopped working until he returned home. So Xavier puts together this international team to launch a rescue mission. They head to the island of Krakoa, not to be confused with the Indonesian island Krakatoa, which its volcano had a huge eruption in 1883. That, and it was the battle cry for Squidward when he was a superhero. Krakatoa! Okay, back on topic. So the X-Men are split into 4 pairs: Nightcrawler and Sunfire, Storm and Colossus, Banshee and Wolverine, and Cyclops and Thunderbird. Each duo faces off against the island's dangerous terrain and mutated wildlife, with plenty of their personalities clashing along the way. Eventually, they all reunite and find the original X-Men all tied up and being sucked. Wait, hold on, that doesn't sound right! The original X-Men are free, but Angel yells, "Are you nuts? That's what I wanted you to do!" Because the plot twist is, Krakoa is alive. Turns out the island itself is a mutant. Mutated by nuclear bomb tests, Krakoa lures in mutants and feeds on their energy. And it used Cyclops as bait to lure in more mutants for his power source. The X-Men throw everything they got at it, but nothing works. Until Professor X links minds with Krakoa and finds a weak point. Storm uses her lightning on Polaris because she has the power of polarity.
You can control poles. No, you dunce. It means she has control over magnetism.
Also, shout out to one of the greatest out-of-context comic panels in Marvel history. Eventually, they manage to defeat Krakoa, and thanks to Iceman's powers, the team escapes. And Angel then asks the big question, what are we going to do with 13 X-Men? And the answer is... Sunfire quits because he's kind of a dick, the original team minus Cyclops leave, and Thunderbird dies shortly after. That leaves 6 core members to carry the X-Men into a bold new era. Unless you count when Jean, Beast, and Angel came back during the Phoenix Saga, but that's a whole other story there. Giant-Sized X-Men was written by comics legend Len Wein and drawn by an incredible Dave Cockrum. It introduced a bold, diverse team of mutants from around the world, a major shift for Marvel at the time. Now, this wasn't the first time the comics featured a multicultural superhero team. Back in World War II, DC gave us the Blackhawks, a squad of fighter pilots from across Europe fighting against the Nazis. One of their members was Chinese, and yeah, his early design was painfully racist. Thankfully, later versions updated his look to be more respectful. Meanwhile, over in 1960s Japan, Shotaro Ishinomori, the creator of Kamen Rider and Super Sentai, or Power Rangers for you normies out there, introduced Cyborg 009, a global team of cyborgs battling the evil Black Ghost organization. It featured one of the first examples of a black man, a Chinese man, and Native American fighting alongside their white counterparts as equals. That being said, their designs haven't aged gracefully, especially for Cyborg 008, the African member, as he looks like he's just straight up wearing blackface.
Whoa, is that blackface, dude?
Keep in mind, there was no racist intentions with this design, just cultural miscommunication. And thankfully this will also be updated to be more respectful. What made the X-Men stand out is even with some rough edges, it tried to portray these characters in a more nuanced, less stereotypical way. Mostly. Characters like Storm, Nightcrawler, and Thunderbird challenge common tropes and set out as unique, powerful figures. Others like Colossus, Sunfire, and Banshee definitely had some exaggerated traits based on national stereotypes, but they were still given depth and dignity. For a mainstream comic in the 1970s, this was progressive. The group dynamic reminds me a lot of the Fantastic Four. A bunch of clashing personalities forced to work together and over time becoming a family. Which brings us to the main point of this video. I'm going to break down the 9 key characters from Giant-Sized X-Men number 1, including Professor X, and explore the cultural influences and real-life history behind each one. And also, I'm keeping this in the 70s era, so no Kitty Pryde, Rogue, Gambit, or Jubilee. No Phoenix Saga breakdown, no confusing retcons, because if you've ever followed X-Men continuity, you already know how messy it gets. We're especially going to ignore the time when they recently tried to shoehorn Miss Marvel into the story. Don't worry, we're going to get to Kamala Khan one of these days, just for a different topic. So with that out the way, let's begin, starting with the leader of the team. Cyclops, the leader of the X-Men and the poster child for following the rules, depending on the era. Early on, he's a straight-laced by-the-book team captain, but in later years he becomes more radical, someone who is willing to do anything to protect mutant kind, even if it means blurring the lines between Xavier and Magneto. We're not diving into that part of his story today, let's focus on this era. At this point, Cyclops is the only original member who stayed with the X-Men, and it's not because of loyalty or glory, it's because he has nowhere else to go. Yes, he can pass as human, but his powers are a curse. When his Ruby Quartz visor or glasses, his optic blast fires uncontrollably. He literally can't look someone in the eye without destroying them. That makes Cyclops one of the earliest and clearest allegories for living with a physical disability in superhero comics. He's someone who has to wear an assistive device at all times just to function in society. His powers isolate him, restrict him, and make even everyday tasks seem dangerous. And like many people with disabilities, he's constantly reminded he's not like everyone else, no matter how normal he may seem from the outside. There's also the psychological toll. Cyclops shows the weight of leadership whether he wants to or not. When Thunderbird dies on their first mission, the guilt hits him hard. And when Jean dies, not once, not twice, but 3 times, he finally steps down and hands leadership to Storm. Because being the responsible, strong one that holds the team together, it takes its toll. So yes, in this era, Cyclops is less about being an edgy mutant revolutionary and more about being the stable soldier who keeps marching even when it hurts. A white Boy Scout, sure, but one who quietly carries a heavy burden that few around him truly understand. It's not flashy, but it's powerful, and it sets the tone for everything that follows. Now for my favorite X-Man, Kurt Wagner, the Incredible Nightcrawler. Kurt represents a lot of things more than most characters in the X-Men lineup. His appearance alone opens the door to multiple allegories: race, gender identity, physical deformities, and even queerness. He looks like a demon and people treat him like one, but underneath that blue fur, tail, and glowing eyes is one of the kindest, most compassionate souls in the Marvel Universe. Early on, Nightcrawler is given an image inducer, a device that hides his true form and lets him appear normal. At first, he's thrilled. For once, people don't fear him and he can finally blend in. But over time, that excitement fades. The image inducer becomes a mask, something that hides who he really is. In a funny twist of fate, after losing a bet to Wolverine, Kurt ditches his image inducers and walks around New York City in his real form. While people are shocked, most don't really bother him. In fact, they're more curious about him. Well, with an exception when he faces these 2 bigots at the end, but hey, it wouldn't be an X-Men story without some kind of prejudice. Still, despite the ending, this is still a sharp contrast to his upbringing in Bavaria, a state in southern Germany known for its conservative Catholic culture. Kurt grew up being hunted, feared, and shunned for what he looked like. It's no coincidence that he was introduced as a monster in West Germany, a country still haunted by its association with the Nazi regime even 30 years after World War II. Despite this, Kurt is one of the most devoutly religious characters in Marvel Comics. Not in a preachy, hypocritical way that most Christians are associated with. He believes in God, yes, but more importantly, he lives by the core values of kindness, forgiveness, and hope. He's a Catholic not in aesthetic, but in action. In a world filled with cynics and extremists, Nightcrawler is the rare voice of compassion and understanding. One aspect of Kurt's identity that often gets overlooked is his Romani heritage. As he was raised in a traveling circus by Romani performers, or called gypsies if you want to be politically incorrect about it, the Romani people have faced centuries of persecution in Europe. They were enslaved, demonized, and during the Holocaust, targeted for extermination, which they would call the Parajmos, or the Devouring. To this day, they're still marginalized, stereotyped, and accused of being dirty, lazy, or criminal. And yet, this piece of Kurt's backstory rarely gets explored in any meaningful way. It's a missed opportunity that could add more richness to his character. So when we look at everything Nightcrawler represents, religious faith, European guilt, outsider identity, and the experience of being seen as inhuman, it's no wonder he fits in the X-Men so perfectly. He's not just a fan favorite because of his cool powers and charming personality. Kurt Wagner embodies what the X-Men are really about: being different and still being good. Probably the second most iconic X-Men character right after you-know-who, but we'll get to him soon. Storm is a trailblazer, the first black female superhero in mainstream American comics. She is a queen, a goddess, a leader, and a symbol. Storm is one of the most pivotal figures in X-Men history. She's strong, but not just in a badass warrior way. She's a leader, she's compassionate, she can be stern but also vulnerable. She can feel fear, anger, joy, and sorrow, and none of that ever weakens her. In fact, it makes her whole. Which unfortunately, outside of X-Men the animated series and now X-Men 97, a lot of adaptations have failed to do her justice. But within the comics, Storm shines. As mentioned earlier, Storm is a black woman, but she's also ethnically and culturally mixed. Her father was African American and her mother was Kenyan. So in many ways, she embodies 2 sides of the global black experience. One rooted in American struggle against white supremacy and segregation, and the other Africa's fight for liberation from colonial rule. From the US side, Storm reflects the legacy of black Americans who endured over 200 years of chattel slavery, only to face another century of racial terror, systematic injustice, and segregation. By the time Storm debuted in 1975, the civil rights boom had just ended, but the wounds were still fresh. Black Americans were still fighting to be seen, heard, and respected. From the Kenyan side, Storm carries the spirit of a nation that just fought for its independence. Kenya was a British colony until the 1950s when the Mau Mau uprising erupted, rebelling against colonial oppression and forced labor. Though often demonized by the British, the Mau Mau were freedom fighters demanding their dignity. Though they weren't always innocent, since they did have their fair share of war crimes as well. That being said, the Mau Mau were still fighting for the future of Kenya despite some of the black spots on the record, and Kenya would finally get independence in 1963. In fact, the Mau Mau uprising was one of the main reasons why Britain pulled out of their African colonies. The conflict cost the British £55 million, which is around $1 billion in today's money. The conflict was such a headache for the British, they just kind of threw up their hands and said, screw it, you want independence? Fine, you can have it. Which kind of went something like this.
It's not worth it. It's just not worth it. Goodbye, everyone. I'll remember you all in therapy.
So here you have a character who channels both of these histories, two peoples, two continents, both fighting to break free from systems of domination, and both still grappling with the aftermath as both still have to deal with the struggle that still persists to this day. Storm isn't just a symbol of power, she's a survivor of legacy trauma. She represents black resilience, leadership, and hope. She's not perfect, but she tries. And she never gives up on creating a better tomorrow. Not just for mutants, but for everyone. That's what makes her such an icon and why she fits perfectly among the X-Men. Because for Storm, being different isn't a weakness, it's sacred. Colossus is another character that I love, a literal steel wall with a soft artistic heart. He hails from the Soviet Union, or as many would call it today, Russia. Although to be clear, the USSR was made up of multiple republics that, one long boring explanation of Russian history later, and that is why Putin is a bitch. During the Cold War, US media constantly painted Russians as villains. It was the era of capitalism versus communism, and comic books were no exception. You had Crimson Dynamo fighting Iron Man, the Red Ghost and the Super Apes going after the Fantastic Four. By the way, go watch my previous video on the Fantastic Four and the Space Race if you want more context on that one. And a Chameleon and Kraven the Hunter harassing Spider-Man, which will be a topic for a future video. Even Black Widow had her debut as a Soviet spy before switching side. The Soviets were the go-to bad guys. Even President Ronald Reagan called the USSR the evil empire, which I respond by saying,
Oh, hi there, Kettle. Name's Potts. Have we met?
Then there's Colossus. From day one, he was never a villain, he was a hero, a gentle giant with a kind soul. Yes, he had the stereotypical Russian strongman vibe, big, stoic, reserved, but look closer and you'll find a guy who loves his family, protects his friends, and paints in his spare time. Literal steel on the outside, pure cinnamon roll on the inside. Sure, some people might write him off as one of the good ones, but Colossus was more than that. He showed that not everyone from so-called enemy nation is the enemy. He wasn't fighting for politics, he was fighting for people. There's even a great storyline where Colossus is brainwashed into becoming a Soviet super soldier, but his friends snap him out of it and he reclaims his identity. Because again, governments don't always represent the people, and that message still hits hard today, especially with everything going on in modern Russia. Even when the regime becomes hostile or oppressive, we should never lose sight of the fact that there are still good people living under it, just trying to get by and do what's right. So in the end, Colossus represents something powerful, a subversion of Cold War stereotypes. A Russian superhero in a time when Russians were always viewed as the bad guys. The most famous X-Men of them all, the Wolverine. Wolverine has been the face of the franchise for decades, arguably its mascot, and that makes sense. He's gritty, cool, mysterious, and always ready to throw hands. Why? Because he's part of the most oppressed group in all of Marvel, Canadians.
Didn't they come up with a cure for your kind?
You got a problem with mutants?
I meant Canadians.
Okay, jokes aside, Canada does have its fair share of marginalized communities, including Black Canadians, the Indigenous First Nation people, and the French-speaking Quebecois. But Logan isn't part of any of those groups, so what makes him so special? Wolverine represents something bigger than nationality. He's a reflection of the cultural shift in American culture during and after the 1970s. After the turbulence of the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and the Watergate scandal, the US was going through a full-on identity crisis. Trust in the government was crumbling and idealism was fading away. And you would see the rise of the anti-hero in pop culture. You have movies like Chinatown, Taxi Driver, Dirty Harry, Shaft, and The Godfather. All stories with morally gray, violent, disillusioned protagonists. And Wolverine fits right into that mold. Gruff, jaded, anti-authority, and emotionally scarred. Then in the 1980s, things took another turn, which would be the rise of the action hero. Schwarzenegger, Stallone, Van Damme, Ford, tough guys with huge muscles, tragic pasts, and a tendency to solve problems by blowing things up. Wolverine somehow captures both vibes. He's got the troubled soul of a Vietnam vet and the feral swagger of an 80s action star. He's the loner who doesn't want to be a part of the team and yet always ends up saving it. Also, it's easy to forget, but Wolverine didn't debut in the X-Men books. His first appearance was in the Incredible Hulk number 180 and 181 respectively. where he was sent by the Canadian government to battle both the Hulk and the Wendigo. For the longest time, Wolverine's past was kept a mystery, but in the 1990s it was revealed that he was a veteran of multiple wars and had been experimented on by the Canadian government through the Weapon X program. A storyline echoing the real-world anxieties about military experiments, MK Ultra, and the treatment of veterans. And that brings us back to the Vietnam connection. Wolverine represents the post-Vietnam era of America's consciousness, a time when soldiers came home not to parades but to indifference or even scorn. Many felt betrayed, abandoned, muted, some were used by the government and then discarded. Logan's pain, rage, and need for connection all stems from that place. He may be Canadian on paper, but spiritually, he's very American in what he represents. A broken man, survivor, and warrior looking for redemption. And if you piss him off, well, you know what comes out of his fist. In my opinion, Banshee is one of the most underrated X-Men. He actually has this cool uncle energy, older than the rest, a little wiser, and always ready with a scream that can shatter steel. Like Wolverine, Banshee didn't make his debut in Giant-Size X-Men #1. He originally showed up in earlier X-Men comics as a villain, though in classic comic fashion, he was actually being mind-controlled at the time. Though what stood out more than anything was his design. Unfortunately, it was very reminiscent of those dehumanizing caricatures of the Irish from the 1800s, the big nose, the exaggerated features, and the ape-like vibe. Thankfully, his design improved over time. Dude, that's the third time I said that. What's with these artists and drawing racist ass caricatures? But beyond that, Banshee's important for another reason. He represents Ireland, and with it, a struggle of history, resistance, and identity. Ireland spent 800 years under British rule, and its people were often treated as second-class citizens both in their own country and abroad. Irish immigrants to the United States were met with hostility, slurs, and systematic exclusion. They were stereotyped as drunk, dirty, lazy, and even violent. But by the late 1960s, Irish Americans had largely assimilated into American society. Sure, there was that moment in the 1963 elections where everyone was doubting John F. Kennedy due to his Irish Catholic heritage, but he won that, so everyone stopped caring. But in the United Kingdom, things were different. After Ireland gained its independence in 1921, Northern Ireland remained a part of the UK. The Catholic minority, many of whom identified as Irish, were routinely discriminated against by the Protestant majority, who largely identified as British. Catholics were denied equal housing, jobs, and political power. Inspired by the American Civil Rights Movement, the Irish Catholics tried to have their own. Here, the Northern Irish Catholics would peacefully protest for their rights to be seen as equal. Unfortunately, due to police brutality and British soldiers killing the protesters, things boiled over. What followed was a 30-year conflict known as the Troubles. A brutal civil war fought on the streets of Belfast and Derry between the Catholic Republicans, the Loyalist Protestants, and the British military. Bombings, assassinations, and state violence became the norm, with many civilians getting caught in the crossfire. Though a peace agreement was eventually reached in 1998, the wounds from that era still linger. Now, Banshee, Sean Cassidy, embodies this quieter side of that struggle. He's not a militant or angry, he's the man who's seen the damage that the Vision causes and wants something better. In a way, he's kind of like Storm. Someone who represents a people long denied dignity, still fighting for right to be heard, seen, and respected. And what better fight with someone like that than the ability to scream with the force of a hurricane, which also goes well with his name. The Banshee is a female spirit in Irish mythology that has this loud scream whenever there's going to be a death in the family. And that scream can also represent the cry of the Irish nation. For all the symbolic weight he carries, Banshee's role in the team is often overlooked. He wasn't flashy and mysterious, he was just dependable, veteran and mentor, and a good ally. And maybe in a franchise built on outsiders finding a home, that's exactly what made him special. Now here's a fascinating one. Like Banshee, Sunfire didn't start off as a hero, he debuted as an antagonist. A fiery Japanese nationalist who attempted to destroy the United States in revenge for Japan's defeat in World War II. By the way, go watch my World at War video for more context there. And here's where it gets deep. Sunfire's mutant powers, his ability to generate solar fire, comes from his exposure to atomic radiation. In other words, his very existence as a mutant is tied to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By the end of World War II, the US dropped 2 nuclear bombs, killing an estimated 150,000 to 250,000 people. And many more suffered horrific injuries, burns, and radiation poisoning. But the survivors, the so-called hibakusha, often faced stigma. Their children were born with deformities, many were ostracized, and some were even thought to be contagious. To make matters worse, the Koreans living in Japan, many of whom had been brought there as forced laborers under imperial rule, were hit even harder. Not only were they also victims of the bombings, but they were also discriminated against because of their ethnicity, with many of them not even having citizenship. Now imagine all that, plus growing up in a country occupied by the very nation that dropped the bombs. This post-war humiliation identity crisis simmered beneath the surface of Japanese society for decades. By the 1960s, a wave of leftist activism surged through Japan, calling for the US to leave and for better working conditions. But in response, there will also be a rise in right-wing nationalism, led by figures who romanticized Japan's imperial past and wanted to restore it to its former glory, with the two sides constantly fighting in the streets. One of the most infamous of these figures was Yukio Mishima, a renowned author and actor who started this right-wing paramilitary group called the Shield Society. In 1970, he attempted a coup to reinstate fascist rule and the emperor's absolute power. And when he failed, he took his own life. Sunfire in many ways channels this era's rage and wounded pride. He's not just angry, he's the product of generational trauma, national humiliation, and deep distrust towards the West. He initially sees the United States and outsiders in general as untrustworthy of Japan's trust. But over time, Sunfire does grow. In one storyline, when the villain Moses Magnum tries to destroy Japan, Sunfire insists on facing him alone, convinced that only a Japanese man should defend Japanese soil. But with the help of the X-Men, he realizes that not all foreigners are the enemy, and that strength can come from unity, not isolation. So yeah, Sunfire is prickly, arrogant, and sometimes outright hostile. But he also represents something real, Japan's trauma, anger, and complicated history, and its long path of healing after such a devastating event. Now we come to Thunderbird, the one who, well, dies. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's give the man his due first. Thunderbird, real name John Proudstar, is an Apache. If you know the history, you know that the Apache people weren't the ones to go down without a fight. For centuries, the Apache resisted wave after wave of colonialism, first the Spanish, then the Mexicans, and finally the Americans. They were like the Vietnamese or Afghans of Native Americans, outnumbered, outgunned, but constantly pushing back against empire after empire. The most legendary of them would be Geronimo, a warrior famous for leading raids against American military outposts and refusing to surrender until the very end. But like many indigenous nations, the Apache were eventually overpowered. They were forced on the reservation, stripped of their land, rights, and dignity. Conditions of those reservations were often and still are plagued by poverty, sickness, substance abuse, and generational trauma. To make things worse, many native children were taken from their families and placed into boarding school, where they were forbidden to speak their language or practice their culture. And all that pain and defiance lives inside Thunderbird. He's angry, proud, and doesn't trust authority, especially not Professor X or Cyclops. And there's another layer to his pain. John Proudstar is also a Vietnam War veteran. Like many Native Americans, he enlisted not because he believed in the war, but because it was a path out of poverty and towards honor. But when he came back home, he returned to a country that treated him like he didn't belong. That's a lot of weight for one man to carry. So looking at all this, it seems like he fits perfectly in this series. So why did they kill him off so early? The honest answer is, he was redundant. Thunderbird had a powerful backstory, but in terms of powers and personality, he overlapped with the other characters. Super strength, Colossus was 10 times stronger. Speed and agility, Nightcrawler could teleport and was more versatile. Angry war veteran with anti-authority attitude, that's Wolverine's whole thing. Victim of colonialism and oppression, Storm, Banshee, and Sunfire each carry those themes too, with more screen presence and international appeal. The creators didn't want to build him up only to ignore him, so instead they made him the first casualty of the new era, a shocking death to show that this team meant business. So while not many people remember Thunderbird, maybe they should. Even if his time was short, he still carried the weight of centuries of native resistance, and that itself made him matter. Last but certainly not least, we have Professor Charles Xavier, leader, teacher, and founder of the X-Men. The man who believes that humans and mutants can live in peace. Now, Professor X is complicated, and I'm not talking about the recent comics that turned him into a morally gray, borderline supervillain. No, this is about his real-world inspirations, because unlike the other X-Men in this video who often represent groups, Professor X is said to be based on individual figures. Which ones? Well, it depends on who you ask. The most well-known story, courtesy of Stan Lee himself, is that Professor X and Magneto were modeled after Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X respectively, two giants of the American civil rights movement with differing views on how to achieve justice and equality. However, writer Chris Claremont, who redefined the X-Men in the late 70s and 80s, later contradicted that. According to him, Xavier and Magneto were based more on David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin, two of Israel's founding political leaders. Magneto's inspiration we'll save for another day, but overall, who's right? Honestly, it's really hard to say. Stan was known for exaggerating, even lying about his achievements. And Claremont, now while creating the X-Men, he was the one that defined them to how we know them today. But for the sake of argument and to be fair, I'm going to look at both of them to see which one's correct. So the first one is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. One of the most iconic figures in American history, King led peaceful protests fighting for desegregation, voting rights, and dignity for Black Americans throughout the American South. And that one time in Chicago in 1966 where even he thought the racism was worse there. He believed that equality was possible through nonviolence and cooperation. Later in life, he began pushing for workers' rights and speaking out against the Vietnam War, which made him even more controversial. He was assassinated in 1968, but his dream of coexistence lives on. It's easy to see how the idealistic philosophy lines up with Xavier's vision. Mutants and humans living side by side through understanding and compassion. Now David Ben-Gurion. If you're not Jewish or don't follow Israeli history, the name might not be familiar. Ben-Gurion is often referred to as the founding father of modern Israel. Born a Jew in Russia during the era of pogroms. By the way, go watch my Superman Jewish Origins video if you want more info on that era. He immigrated to Palestine and spent decades fighting for a Jewish homeland. When Israel officially formed in 1948, he became its first prime minister. Under his leadership, Israel fought multiple wars with the Arab states and absorbed Jewish refugees from around the world. He allowed Arab citizens within Israel to have rights, but he also expelled many Palestinians from their homes during the 1948 war, and launched the invasion of Egypt during the Suez Crisis in 1956. Which, an interesting fact, actually has connections to Storm's origin, since that's how her parents were killed and she ended up being an orphan in Cairo. These actions are deeply controversial today as they played a key role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Another controversial aspect of him is that he wasn't willing to save a lot of Jews during the Holocaust. You see, after one of the Nazis' biggest purges in 1938, Gurion stated this: "If I knew that it was possible to save all the children of Germany by transporting them to England, and only half by transferring them to the land of Israel, I would choose the latter, for before us lies not only the numbers of these children, but the historical reckoning of the people of Israel." And this is the kind of Xavier that we see in modern comics, someone willing to sacrifice idealism for survival, even if it means making morally questionable decisions. I know I said I wouldn't talk about the modern era, but this is a connection that needed to be made. And this is why many fans tend to lean towards the MLK as a true inspiration for Xavier, especially in his early portrayal. Because despite all the bullcrap, he wouldn't sacrifice all of his morals. But if there's one person I think that actually embodies Xavier's ideals, that would be Nahum Goldman.
Who?
For those who don't know, Goldman was the founder of the World Jewish Congress and a prominent Zionist leader. But unlike Ben-Gurion, he wasn't focused solely on Israel. He believed Jews should be able to live safely anywhere in the world. He also supported peace efforts between the Israelis and Arabs and was one of the earliest advocates for the two-state solution. He would even try to talk with various Arab leaders, which was seen as high treason. He would even call it the hypocrisy of the Israeli government using the Holocaust as an excuse for their crimes against the Palestinian people. Goldman believed if the Israelis and Arabs didn't live in peace, then Israel would be destroyed. Which, knowing how things are going on right now, he was definitely onto something. If you ask me, this is why I think Goldman fits the idealistic Xavier even better than Ben-Gurion or MLK, because he didn't just fight for protection, he fought for mutual understanding, even if it made him unpopular. So yeah, Xavier's roots are very complicated. But the ideal of Professor X, the man who dreams of a world where difference doesn't mean danger and peaceful coexistence is still worth fighting for, that's still one of the most inspiring things in superhero fiction. Overall, this is my favorite version of the X-Men, one I wish got more love. For me, Giant Size X-Men #1 marks the moment when the franchise truly found its voice. This was the era when the X-Men became more than just another superhero team. They became a mirror reflecting the struggles of people around the world. From race and religion to colonialism, war, disability, and identity, each member representing something bigger than themselves. And sure, it wasn't perfect. Some characters leaned on stereotypes, others were sidelined, and then there was Thunderbird who was gone before he really got a chance. But the foundation was there, a team that was international, diverse, and unapologetically different. And from that foundation, the X-Men grew into one of the most endearing and meaningful superhero stories ever told. So when I look back at Giant Size X-Men #1, I don't just see a comic that saved the struggling book, I see the birth of something bold, messy, and powerful. Something that said heroes can come from anywhere, from any people, from any struggle. And to me, that's the X-Men at their very best.